I mean,
oh my God, that is a terrible hot take, Nick. Like an absolutely rotten hot take. And the reason that I think it's a terrible hot take is because it's just classic Scotch whiskey dogma. You're just spouting out no actual sort of rooted in the reality of what it is, which it's not about whiskey being young and it's not about whiskey being old. It's about whiskey being balanced. And you of all people should know that.
Wow. That's what kind of heat we need.
Yeah, no, listen, I'm telling you right now, I've been on about
I'm glad we're not in the same room.
Hours of Skype. I've been on about 9 hours of Skype and Zoom conference calls today. I'm all sorts of fired up and ready to go.
Oh, baby. Just bringing the heat. I didn't know I was going to get blindsided like that, Zacharias. I did not say that. I said old Scotch is better than young Scotch. And I would stick to that because the Scots are not an agriculturally driven product. And so you don't worry about losing grain flavor over time, which obviously is not the case with Westland. And I think it's probably one of the coolest parts of Westland because you go to Scotland, you get into single malt when you're just starting in the whiskey industry and you're blown away by 12 years and 18 years. And like when I got into the business side of it and not just as a hobbyist, 12 years stopped being a number. It started being a reality of like, oh God, if I want to start a distillery and I want it to have a substantial age statement, I'm going to be 40 before I have anything that's decent. And that was shocking to me. And then of course I met Chris Riesbeck and he was working for Gordon MacPhail and he just pounded that theory right down my throat even more. And now he's with Westland.
So
no,
I
go ahead.
think I was going to say it's interesting. If you put the caveat on it about Scotch whiskey, I would argue that there's probably more truth to that statement, that I think older Scotch whiskey on the average, and there are notable exceptions to this, of course, but I think older Scotch whiskey on the average is a more developed and nuanced and often balanced flavor. And a lot of that is because you think about the way that the average Scotch whiskey distillery considers flavor development in their whiskey, right? They're looking at barley and they're looking at yeast as a way to drive yield, right? They want to make as many liters of alcohol, pure alcohol, as humanly possible off that still, with the expectation that the only thing that's going to drive the development of flavor for that, obviously to a certain degree, the shape and size of the stills, but more so the type of barrel and the length of time that the whiskey is going to be matured. Now, if you know that you've kind of designed your whole production facility to be built around making a bunch of relatively inexpensive alcohol and then waiting for the warehouse for all the flavor to be developed, then you're going to probably have to sit on that spirit for a while to turn it into something really compelling. Whereas, and obviously a shout out to our sister distillery on Isla, Bruichladdich. Bruichladdich does their classic Lottie. It's a non-vintage cuvee style bottling. That stuff, there's no age statement on that. Obviously you can potentially have some younger whiskey in that. That whiskey's super well balanced because their program is built around the idea of creating flavor through balance and not by just, frankly, an over-reliance on cask and time to produce something compelling.
Yeah, I would actually bring up your other sister distillery, which is Domaine de Haute Glace, which is a French distillery, which is a super interesting and compelling agriculturally driven whiskey distillery.
Absolutely.
Also acquired by Remy. And so Remy has basically taken a position, to me, on terroir and provenance. And Westland, Bruichladdich, I think, was the first, then Westland, then Domaine de Haute Glace, which is this really cool French malt distillery. They actually make single malt rye and single malt barley whiskey. I actually visited them last year, which was really, really cool.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And what I think is really cool is they are releasing a young whiskey. They're mostly single estate, so they're growing their own barley,
nice.
And then they're sourcing it from all.
Am I the only one who's lost here?
Around there?
Yeah, that's good for me.
Oh, I froze for a second. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, but I think what's really cool is like when you release a young whiskey, you can really let the grain speak in a way that older whiskeys don't. And I think another awesome example that we actually chatted with 2 episodes ago with Josh Hatton was.
Oh man, I love Josh.
Young Peter whiskey. Yeah, Josh is the man. But like some of these, we had a 5-year Lefroy, which was arguably the best single cask nation bottling Nick and I have tried. And it's like, and Nick and I also went on a quest to find some sourced single casks of Scotch. and everything's been picked over, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But the things that were the most compelling were like 4-year-old Kalilas.
Yep.
And
it's ironic that you point out Kalila, because I'd argue Kalila, from a Scottish distillery perspective, is probably some of the most interesting young whiskey you can get. Like, you can get 8 and 9-year-old Kalilas. Those are fantastic bottles of whiskey, especially when they're at cask strength.
Totally. And Ardbeg does a lot of young stuff in their
Yep.
which is really good. Nick, go for it.
Yeah, sorry. The Westland peated, interestingly to me, is the closest resemblance to single malt Scotch, and it sort of brings up the entire conversation about what single malt should taste like. We have this whole idea of like we have this whole idea when you say single malt, you can almost always just abandon the word Scotch and people still think you're talking about Scotch, right?
Yep.
And so we have these preconceived notions as to what single malt should taste like, and I find that Westland and what people may be used to with single malt are pretty far away, except for in the Venn diagram of the Westland peated and the Scotch peated. And I think part of that is obviously the smoke character is relatively uniform. We can talk a little bit more about like where we're getting the peat from, but for the most part, that smokiness is relatively uniform. And the Scots want to preserve that smoky character, and so they actually tend to bottle peated whiskeys younger and not actually put an age statement on it.
Yeah.
Actually, Chris, I was curious. We were talking beforehand, and Phil brought this up that he had heard somewhere that you guys were trying to harvest some American peat. Is that possible?
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. So not only are we trying to, we actively are. Now, I should preface this by saying the Westland peated that you're going to see in stores now, that whiskey is being made with obviously some of our 5 malt barley bill where we use those roasted malts, but the peated malt in that is specifically coming from Baird's out in Inverness. So it's their non-coastal, non-island, Highland-style peated malt. So roughly 55 parts per million. It's on the higher side. But because that only makes up a fraction of what the total cask that would go into that vatting, it's what makes our peated whiskey really more of a, if you're a beer drinker, I always use the word sessionable, right? It's meant to be the kind of peated whiskey you can have 2 or 3 glasses of. I always get a kick out of this. You'll see people go to bars and restaurants, they'll start with like, not to pick on these guys, but they'll start with Lagavulin, they'll start with Lefroy, they'll start with Ardbeg. They'll have like 1 glass and then it's switching over to a beer or to red wine. I'm in the business of trying to sell people the 2nd and 3rd glass. So, I mean, for me, it's I want people to be able to have our whiskey as an aperitif before the meal, during the meal with food, and after the meal as sort of a digestif. And the only way you can do that is if the flavors are balanced and nuanced and not so excessive and heavy-handed that they sort of blow the palate out. For the Washington State peat stuff, we've been sourcing now for a number of years from a private family's peat bog in Shelton, Washington. So if you think of the Puget Sound, if you get out to like the southwestern edge of it over towards the Olympic Peninsula, we're sourcing from over there. And what's interesting is that the vegetation in those peat bogs is really dramatically different from what you would classically think of for the Scottish peat bog. And not just the difference between like a Highland peat bog and a coastal or island peat bog, but really it's way more about like, we're seeing like crab apples, cranberries. We have a thing called Labrador tea, which is part of the rosemary family, which used to be an old Native American medicinal herb, some really cool stuff like that. So we have a release in mind. At this point, I'm going to venture to guess and say probably 2022, maybe 2023 will be the inaugural release of that. And that will be focused on those Washington State, not only Washington State peat, but also doing Washington State barley as well.
That's really cool.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to take some. It's going to take some getting used to. That's the only thing I have to explain to people pretty quickly. I've been fortunate enough to try some of this stuff from the distillery. Obviously, we try to lab sample stuff pretty regularly to get a sense of how the maturation's going. And we've got a couple of them that are a few years old now at this point. So it's, this has been an ongoing project. And one of the things that I'm struck by is the herbaceous note that exists in these. You're not going to get that aggressive tobacco, slightly acrid note that we classically associate with Scottish peated whiskey. It's going to be much more of a eucalyptus menthol kind of note. It's really fascinating, but again, it's going to require people to openly accept the fact that peat is not a yes or no question. Nick and Zach, the number of times you've probably heard me use that line in particular over the years is pretty high. But it's nothing's more frustrating from the distillery perspective is, people treat peated whiskey like it's a yes or no, right? They come in and they go, is this peated? And it doesn't matter if it's Oban or Talisker, Lafroig, Lagavulin, Port Charlotte, Octomore, or Westland. They just go, I don't drink peated whiskey. And it's like, well, wait a minute. That's like saying, going to a great wine bar and saying like, I don't drink Chardonnay. Well, you might not drink all Chardonnay, but the fact that to say that you don't drink all of them, I'll be the worst offender, right? I'm classically not a big bourbon guy for the most part, but every once in a while I taste bourbon that I'm just blown away by.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to say that I was most intrigued by the fact that this was American peat because it's the terroir is going to be different. It's going to have a different character entirely, and it's something like that is absolutely new. It's like it's going to be unique and strange and fun.
There are a lot of peat bogs in the United States, to be clear. The challenge is that a majority of them are in wetlands, and wetlands on the average are protected by the EPA. So you're going to have a lot of places where they're completely inaccessible. Washington State, because of the size of the oyster farming community, there are some interesting laws about owning the first XYZ number of feet going into the coastline from your homes. So private family owners can potentially farm oysters and things like that, obviously with the proper permitting, but also having access to the land. Well, for us, we have the exact same thing. The big difference is that we're trying to do it in a much more sustainable method. So we're not like, completely like digging out the entire area and pumping out all of the water. The idea is how can we do this, to be a much more not only sustainable method, but also in a way where thinking about like, how can we get an accurate amount or an adequate amount of ppms, right, in the barley? The years and years and years ago, they used a ton of peat to smoke things because they didn't realize that there was a way of doing it sort of the barbecue low and slow, or just an enormous amount of peat and trying to like flash in that intense sort of phenol reek into the barley. What we're doing and what we're experimenting with Skagit Valley Malting up in the Skagit Valley, who's doing all of the barley for us with this stuff, is that there are different ways and the amounts are different. In the beginning, they were pelletizing the peat, which was super interesting. And now they've moved away from that because they found that the concentration of the reek was higher without it.
Wow, that's
super interesting. So
Yeah.
Piggybacking off of the discussion about the peat that you guys are using versus how Scottish malts are traditionally using peat, what would you say from a flavor perspective and from an approach perspective, which we started to touch on, is the biggest difference between what Westland is doing and Scotch as a category? Obviously, that's a broad question, but like, what do you think is like, this is different? This is like notably different, like Japanese whiskey, right? It's got a style that's different from Scotch. And actually, that's another question is, how do you think American Single Malt will have a category? But how does Westland and maybe how does American Single Malt most distinguish from the other sort of regionalities, primarily Scotch, that we associate with certain styles?
So that there's a lot to unpack there. So let me kind of pick them apart as individual things. So let's start with the easiest one. Do I think that American Single Malt will have an actual category? Absolutely, 100%. So back in 2016, our distillery, along with a few other American single malt producers in the U.S., sat down in Chicago and basically wrote up a standard of identity and sort of think of it as an enforceable list of what we wanted any producer that was going to make American single malt to have to do from a production perspective. We have petitioned the federal government via the TTB, which is a part of the Department of Treasury. We've sent those things into them. It is under sort of review right now. Our anticipation is realistically with between 6 months and a year, American single malt whiskey or American single malt as a category will legally mean something, meaning that you as a consumer, when you pick up a bottle, you can be guaranteed that it's going to be X, Y, and Z. And what I would encourage people to do is to go over to americansinglemaltwhiskey.org after this and sign up as a supporter of the commission. One of the neat things about that is that you'll get, I don't want to say it's weekly, but certainly at least once a month, you'll get communications from the group. It's a way for you to see how many producers there are. I mean, listen, 2016, there's 8 or 9 of us. Now there's well over 150. And again, for a producer like Westland.
Yeah. Is that number actually that are only making single malt, or is it distilleries that are like craft guys that are like, we make 27 different things, including a single malt release?
That is, so yeah, it's a huge number of them are obviously making single malt as a tertiary item, right? It's not their primary focus. But to be honest with you, in my mind, that's not a bad thing. Listen, there's a reason that we only make single malt at Westland, and it's because in the Pacific Northwest, the most authentic type of whiskey we could possibly produce is a single malt. We grow malting grade barley all over the Northwest and the Pacific Northwest in general. Washington State has a fantastic brewing industry. Certainly the most closely adjacent thing to making single malt whiskey would be brewing beer, from a mashing and fermenting perspective. And, for us, it was, how do we reflect the agriculture and frankly, just the actual culture of the Northwest? And the way to do that was to make single malt whiskey. So yeah, while there's only still probably a handful of us that are exclusively making single malt, I am all for people making single malt whiskey. If they think they can make it, make high quality single malt and then make it for the right reasons, right? To make something different, to promote the category instead of just doing it as an add-on for the sake of saying like, yeah, we also make this. I'll be honest with you, from the numbers perspective, the cost of producing single malt is very, very high. Your rough material cost, your raw material cost in grain is, 5 to 6 times the cost of most sort of basic ingredients in a bourbon style production. So, you're doing it for the right reasons for the most part if you're going to do anything. For the other question that you were asking about the idea of, how do we think of ourselves versus Scotch whiskey? It's challenging to say. I mean, obviously, I think one of the things that's really unique about American Single Malt is the general progressiveness of the category. And I think I'm really proud of the fact that Westland, we've been really leading the charge of that across the board. Our use of different types of malted barley, including roasted malt in our standard bottling, the fact that we use a Belgian Saison brewer's yeast, the fact that we exclusively use air-dried new white American oak for maturation of our core whiskeys, like that is, we laugh all the time, but we say at the distillery, it's like, if a distillery anywhere else in the world did one of those things, it would be like their most expensive groundbreaking whiskey, right? It'd be $300 a bottle. And they'd be like, oh yeah, we can only make like 10 cases a year. For us, like that's our standard go-to everyday bottling. Like American oak for $70 a bottle in the US is an absolutely incredible deep dive into the possibilities of what single malt whiskey can be.
Yeah, totally agree, actually. And the challenge is just getting people to appreciate, to value those elements as opposed to probably just an age statement. And also a category being single malt Scotch, because you're always going to fight an uphill battle, at least in our time right now. You're fighting a huge uphill battle.
I think you're right. I mean, people look at it, listen, at the end of the day, people still see Westland, and the people in the know see it as a single malt distillery, which is what it is. But there's also the other side of it, the sort of general whiskey enthusiast in this country that goes, American whiskey equals bourbon or American whiskey equals rye. And I don't understand why this is 70 when all these other things are 30. Because they're not walking the single malt Scotch whiskey shelf, because in their mind, I'm a Jack Daniels, Jim Beam kind of drinker. They don't, in their mind, that's what whiskey should cost. But when you talk to someone that's a single malt drinker, $70 for a bottle of single malts, drop in the hat.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
We got a couple delightful questions coming in.
Oh boy.
My one that I noticed earlier was for Chris. What is the and don't give me the core range. What is the must-have Westland single malt expression? I have my answer.
Okay. I would say there's two of them. One from a collectability perspective and one from you've got to try this because it set the standard. 2016 Garyana is the one you've got to try. You got to find a bottle. You got to crack it open. You got to drink it because it's incredible. It was obviously our first bottling of American Single Malt. It was just fascinating. Our first bottling of a Garyana bottling, right? We had done some single cast prior for a couple of markets. I know you guys have a little bit of that, but it was the first time we had done something in the Garyana series, and it was just such an incredible whiskey. I remember being at the distillery that day when we launched it, and there was like a line down the road. I mean, a couple hundred people, super exciting, like the kind of enthusiasm for a new release that you are always hoping for, but never guaranteed of.
Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say from a collectability perspective, it's got to be Deacon Seat. So Deacon Seat would be considered sort of the precursor to, American Oak. It was a 375 distillery only release that only a couple hundred bottles got made. I have a bottle. I'll actually admit this. I've never actually tasted it. I wasn't working at the distillery when they had made that, but I have a bottle in the basement. And I'm like, honestly, if this thing lasts like another month, I'll probably just dig into it.
Okay. For me, the first time I had Garyana Oak, I was just flattened. And really, it's like you see a ton of oak being used around the world, and oak, for the most part, I find a lot of times you're going to see a lot of gimmicks. You saw a lot of a few years ago, you would see like, we sent this Scotch barrel to a brewery. They aged an IPA in there for 3 weeks. We then sent it back and aged, and it was just like, get the fuck out of here. What is this? Like, it is just absurd.
I want to point out, because I think this is a total thing I should dig in on. I love that kind of stuff, right? I like barrel age. We have a great cask exchange program where we do a brewery exchange with local breweries. But nothing annoys me more when you hear distilleries, and this is all over Scotland right now, where they're like, look how innovative we are. We're aging stuff in beer. And it's like, do you guys not remember like 100 years ago? Like, those barrels didn't get shipped from Europe, like empty back. Like, they filled them with whiskey and shipped them back. They filled red wine casks. They filled rum casks. Like, it is amazing to me the things that people try to pass off as innovation.
It is ridiculous the things that people try to pass off as innovation. I will say that Mizunora Oak is not just flat out innovation, and I will say Garyana Oak is not just like we're passing this off as innovation. These are ancient ass trees. I think one of the funniest. I got to interview Matt right when this was released a couple of years ago. We were at Wink and Nod, and I was interviewing him. I was interviewing him. And it was hilarious because there kept being power outages, which kept setting off the fire alarm. So I've got this video of Matt where I interviewed him for 2 hours, and every 20 minutes the fire alarm would go off, and his face in high def, just being like with the huge beard, was absolutely priceless. That being said, it was the first time I tried this Garyana, and he told me that the ratio of Garyana Oak to the standard American Oak was an 11 barrel release, and only 2 of them were Garyana, because Garyana is that potent.
You don't need it. Yeah.
And it really is, because the other thing that he was telling me was the wood that they're harvesting, that you guys are harvesting out there, first of all, protected species. So the trees have to fall on their own, which I always think is just hilarious. He was telling me stories about knocking on people's doors because he'd see a fallen tree in their backyard or on their property, and just being like, "Hi, can we come harvest your tree?" And
for years, we literally had a guy that we had basically had on a contract basis to go around and like talk to people and be like, when that tree falls down, or if you get a bad windstorm, you call us. And like literally, but their company would cut the tree down, right? They would cut the tree up when it was standing, when it was on the ground. They would put it into board footage, and then they would pay the people who they took the tree from. Like, I mean, anyone that's ever had a tree fall on their property knows it's like hundreds of dollars to get that done. And here you are, like, cashing a check as the result of it.
As a result, right? So, and then if I recall correctly, these trees live, if they're healthy, which is of course what you want. You don't want termite infested trees. If you're using a healthy one of these trees, their life cycle is like 350 to 450 years, something around there.
Yeah, to hit maturity, it's in that range. So I mean, we do a project at the distillery right now where we're planting Gary Oak trees each year as the distillery team. We go out to Gary Oak Savannas just south of the city of Seattle near Tacoma, and we're literally planting these trees. And then we have to go back out a few months later and literally like open up the area, because the oak grows so slowly that just native grass will overtake it and literally block out the sun. It's one of the big reasons why things like controlled burns were so popular, because oak being a hardwood, what you'd end up getting is it would just kill off all the grasses. You'd allow those saplings to potentially come up. It's really kind of amazing. We do this work with this company called Forterra, and they're just fantastic land management company.
Well, the two things that I thought were the coolest things from this whole conversation I had was, one, the flavor profile that you get, because it's the most intense whiskey flavor profile. The mesquite, the barbecue, the just like the intensity of flavor is ridiculous, to the point where you couldn't do a release like this and use all Garyana oak because it would just be absolutely nuclear. The second takeaway was, I remember I asked him and I said, all right, you're planting your own trees, but these things live for hundreds of years. Like, when are they going to be used? When are you going to be able to use them? And Matt just looked me dead in the eye and goes, oh, about 180 years. I was like, you got to be fucking kidding me.
And that's not even the point of it.
Right. And that's yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that, the point of it isn't to use these things. There's a thing at Westland that I'm really sort of compelled by. It's about this concept of legacy. Are you leaving a legacy for the Northwesterners to come that's better than the one that, you've had in your cultural generation? And I feel that's something that pulls really strongly at everyone that works at Westland. We're really mindful of this. We want to leave the Northwestern environment in a place where, we don't have to go to kids and say, oh, remember, you've never seen one of these, but there used to be these amazing things called Gary oak trees, and this was the way to do it. And I can appreciate that. I'm sure people find it ironic that we mature a whiskey in something that would be considered a protected species, which is understandable. But again, to your point, we're not cutting these things down. We're actively working the land to ensure proper growth from them. But even more than that, it's, we had to develop an economy for this. You hear this all the time with other things, but you'll hear people say like, well, we don't know what it's worth because you're not selling anything with it. At least with Garyana, listen, if we were doing a Garyana bottling, like, for the sake of argument, let's just say $50 a bottle, the value of it would actually be significantly less by elevating it to something at this much higher point and really having a place of sort of honor within our own release calendar. We celebrate Gary Oak by treating it with the respect that it deserves.
I love the bottle has the Gary Oak. It looks like a fingerprint. It's it looks like it's really cool. But Zach, you telling me we got a bunch of questions queued up. Fire them off. Rapid fire, Chris.
All right. There's a couple of really good questions that I think tie really well into some of the agricultural stuff you just started talking about. So a question from Pablo is, when are we seeing a local bar, local yeast, local peat, local wood, Westland? And I'll tie on another one from Tammy, which is, has Westland thought about going with an all organic bottling? And the fact that you're getting these questions is a testament to what people find compelling about Westland and exciting about it. So I'm curious. I am also quite curious about whether you're going in that direction.
Okay, so I'll start with Tammy's just because I've actually been looking into this over the last couple of weeks with our team. So we are looking into what an organic bottling would look like. One of the major challenges of it is the cost of our grain already is quite high. To do organic versions of roasted malts, our per pound price would easily be in excess of $3 a pound. And, to be totally honest with you, and this is just part of the business that I should be transparent about, is, those costs can't get absorbed by the distillery over and over. So one of the things is, does that mean that, do we make a version of American oak that's organic that's, $140 a bottle? I don't know if there's a big enough market for that, to be honest with you. So as much as it's something that I love the idea of, I also have to balance the commercial realities of what our industry is going to provide right now. The other question about sort of a local bottling, yeah, we've definitely talked about that. The only part of that would be challenging is I don't anticipate that we're going to experiment much with our yeast. Messing around with fermentation is a dangerous game. Ask any brewer. We're really happy with our Belgian Saison brewer's yeast. We like the flavors that it produces, especially knowing that we could potentially still do some cool roasted malt stuff. We will have a release in the fall of this year celebrating local barley, which is super exciting. So that's definitely something to keep your eyes out for, like a September, October release in the US.
That's awesome. Okay. I had a couple other good ones. Oh yeah. I had another really interesting one that actually Sammy threw in there. So you talk about basically what you just said to me is the importance of the consumer, right? Like if the consumer if the consumer buys these products, it gives you more ability to go pursue innovation in that direction. And it kind of depends on us to give that feedback that we'll pay more for that because we value it. And I think one of the questions that Sammy asked that I think is interesting is, how is Westland being received abroad? And I know that I saw you at Whiskey Live in Paris.
Yeah.
And France, and you talk about Domaine de Haute Glace, like to me, they tend to be a little bit ahead of us in embracing certain trends and spirits that I think are really cool, including rum, including terroir, including these sort of farm distilleries. And I'm curious how you guys are being received in France and Europe and just abroad in general.
Yeah, so it's been exciting. So over I would say the last 18 months, I've been traveling overseas quite a bit, sometimes with Matt, to basically launch Westland in a bunch of new export markets. So to back up a touch, so back in 2016, right before the acquisition by Remy Cointreau, we were exporting a small amount of whiskey to a couple of different countries. When we got acquired, we decided, because we wanted to get familiar with the sort of the new situation and frankly, the new ways of doing business within the group, we pulled all of that business back. And then in the beginning of 2019, we started exporting again. So we started going to, we've been in Canada for a number of years, but that's certainly an export market. We went back to the UK, to France, to Singapore, to Japan, and to Australia, as well as in Sweden and Norway. So it's interesting. The point you made about France being maybe a little ahead of us on single malt is a fair one. And I think the reason for it is because America is arguably, in my mind, the only country on the planet, when you say whiskey, the assumption isn't single malt. So I think that there is a greater engagement to single malt whiskey overseas in almost every other country than there is in the US. I think it's changing. Certainly things are adjusting here and getting better, and that's great. And I hope we'll continue to see that. But there's also just way more choice here. You think about it, like there is still an enormous level of access to global single malts, Scottish single malts, American single malt, bourbon, rye, wheat. I mean, you walk through a liquor store nowadays and it's just like, it feels like it's, coming over the top of you at this point. It's just so much. So I think I think we will get there. I just think the challenge is how do we get people to recognize that, I mean, we still hear this all the time, right? It's getting people to understand that whiskey is the broad term, right? And then there are all these little subdivisions of what whiskey can be.
For sure. Phil, what else we got in the question queue?
So I got a question from Ryan. Has Westland ever distilled with Golden Promise barley or whatever the traditional barley is in use in Scotland?
Yeah, we did do a Golden Promise bottling a while back. We've done some really cool stuff. Last summer, we did a thing called the Summer of Single Cask, where we released 3 separate varietals. And I say that and I always catch myself. We did 2 separate varietals and then 1 Pilsner level sort of malting. So that was really interesting. That was sort of in a way to build anticipation for this fall's release of our Skagit Valley barley kind of focus.
Interesting. I remember the first time I came across Golden Promise was in Michael Jackson's Complete Guide to Single Malt Scotch. Dude was a great dancer, but he was also a great whiskey writer. And I remember I was reading about. I'm worried that some people don't get that joke.
You've got to be really careful. They might have no idea what you're talking about.
Nah, I think people. Okay. Michael Jackson was also the most famous whiskey writer of all time. Does that settle it up? No. The most famous. Thank you. Grab the book. I'll grab mine in a minute. Actually, I'm using mine to prop up my shit.
There are 2 Michael Jacksons.
They might have a picture. He wasn't. I always kind of laugh because I always thought he looked a little bit like Peter Jackson.
Oh, I get that.
Yeah, it does.
A little bit, right?
Anyway, I remember I was reading through Michael Jackson's Complete Guide to Single Malt, the World Complete, whatever the hell it's called, which was like the OG book that actually talked about like real facts about whiskey. Pre that, everything I ever read pre 2000 when that was first published is like utter nonsense. But he was talking about how Macallan used Golden Promise. And it was like a huge pillar of, what they were saying. And then he basically went on to thumb his nose at the idea that barley had any effect on flavor. And it's interesting because when I went to Scotland and you go to these distilleries and they're talking about the process and you just hear that you'd ask them, you'd be like, so how does barley impact the flavor? And a lot of places would just be like, it's irrelevant. And then a lot of places would explain like, oh, it could be relevant, but our entire process is designed for certain fermentation times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. That's one of those things that I actually appreciate when they're transparent about it and they just be clear. I don't think the general consumer, for the most part, appreciates just how significant the downstream effect is on making a single adjustment to your production process, whether it's an acquisition of raw materials, the way you want to mash things, the way you want to ferment things, the way you want to distill things. Like those things are major sort of, what do they call it? Like butterfly effect things where you change one thing and then the end product is a dramatically different whiskey. So, I will say this about the sort of that mindset where barley doesn't have flavor, that, that wasn't just a Michael Jackson thing. That is an unfortunately sort of well-regarded mindset by a lot of people. And it's just nonsense, to be honest with you. I mean, you can't help but to try some of these unique varietals. But again, if you were to treat those varietals all the same way, you'd probably end up with a fairly consistent product. So maybe that's, again, this sort of them sort of self-selecting their own answer. But from my perspective, I mean, I've tasted new make from things like NZ151 and new make from Talisman and Pilot, and they're all dramatically different. I mean, it's hard to even assume that there'd be a way that you would confuse them as the same thing.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the biggest point you ever hear is, I remember I was talking, I was talking to Matt, I was interviewing Hoffman. And by the way, we haven't like fully introduced who the hell Matt Hoffman is. Matt Hoffman is not just a BMX biker. I'm just killing it with this. Matt Hoffman is not just a BMX biker. He also happens to be. The reason I was interviewing him was because he just was named to the Forbes 30 under 30 list for food, wine, and beverages or whatever it was. And it was highly well deserved. Matt Hoffman being the master distiller at Westland, I think one of the most brilliant distillers / people I've ever talked to. One of the sort of best experiences I ever had with him, you were actually there, Chris, was when we were at Allagash, in between two of the sessions at Julio's Go Whiskey Weekend, and we were having lunch. We were pre-gaming the shit out of the.
I remember that.
Yeah, and we're pre-gaming, and there were like 15 of us there, and it was really funny because it was Josh, it was you, I think Sammy was there, and Matt was there. And the only girl there was actually Alex, my partner / girlfriend, and she was sitting in there, kind of like, what the hell am I doing here with all these whiskey nerds? But I remember we started asking Matt about, I can't even remember what it was, and he went on a 10-minute riff about like chemical processes and this, and he was just going, and he finally stopped, and his eyes kind of went big, and he was like, am I boring you guys? And everyone simultaneously was like, no, please, please keep talking. It was the geekiest, happiest group I've ever seen, just slinging back beer. But to circle all the way back, I remember I was asking him specifically about the barley, and he just turns to me and he goes, beer. And I was like, what? And he was like, beer is barley plus yeast, and you get the entire variety, like outside of hops, you get the entire variety of flavor. And he was like, you really think all of these things, all of these beers, all of this variety is created with grain and yeast, and it's irrelevant in how Scotch whiskey ends up tasting? And it was just, it was just like a click moment for me. And the thing I sort of was that I grasped from that, the thing I grasped from reading Michael Jackson's book, and also just the first time I ever went to Scotland, I'm going around to all these distilleries, and I had this really funny experience where my taxi driver in Speyside was a former distillery manager, and I know, awesome. And he was taking me from place to place, and he owned he retired and he bought a taxi company, and one of his guys was sick. And so he happened to be working that week, and he gave me his number and he said, call me. And every time we go to the distillery, I'll tell you what they told you was bullshit. He was like, I'll be your sort of truth meter. And I would go around and I would get out of the distillery. I'd get out of the distillery tour and I'd get in the cab with him and I'd go through my notes. I had these 6 stacks of notes. I'd go through these notes and I'd be like, this distillery said this. What do you think? And you go, oh, they're telling you this because, commercial reason. And it was always some reason why they were tongue-tied. But then you would read the same thing in distillery, in books about distilleries. And what I discovered was, and maybe I'm a fool for not realizing this at a younger age, but I was 23 at the time. What I discovered was what we're told and what is considered like fact, particularly when it comes to flavor, is highly evolving, would be sort of the euphemism I would use. It's constantly.
You got to think about it from this perspective, right? Almost all of the knowledge in the whiskey industry is driven by what distilleries are willing to tell people and give access to. And the challenge is that at a point, if they want something to become dogma, they can force it to become dogma. And that's really sort of challenging. It's one of the reasons that we take transparency so seriously, even frankly, when it doesn't potentially shine us in the best light, because that's really what the industry needs. The industry needs people to be incredibly precise with the way they talk. There is no shame in telling people you don't know a technical question, and I find that to be a thing. Like, listen, I'm 3 years into getting my master's from Harriet Watton Brewing and Distilling Sciences. And I always laugh because when I talk to Matt, who went through the program as well, it's just to see how much he's had to consistently engage with it to keep that stuff going. It's, I think of myself as fairly knowledgeable. I'm an avid home brewer. I do a lot sort of in the thoughts on fermentation and things like that. But I look at someone like Matt and I'm like, it just goes to show there aren't any hobbyists at that level.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Led us so beautifully into a question that Nick and I had that was burning, that we were talking about before we started the show. And we were wondering, you're getting your what degree?
I'm getting my master's in the sciences.
Which for the uninitiated, which is 99.9% of us, Harriet Watt is a university in Edinburgh that is the preeminent university in the world in terms of distilling and brewing. And Matt Hoffman was a graduate of there. A bunch of the distillery teams in Scotland graduate out of Harriet Watt. Chris is getting his degree from there. And I'm curious, Chris, what is the biggest change in perspective that you've had from attending that school? Like, what did you come away with? Be like, I never thought of it that way. Not super technical, just like bigger picture. Oh. What's the biggest takeaway? Like, damn, that is something I did not realize mattered as much as it did, or whatever.
So it's interesting because a lot of the things that you learn within the program is designed to be more in the European model, like M strain yeast and, getting your yields up and all of that, because it's also designed for someone that's going to work in a production distillery. And it's understandable. Because the program really has a heavy emphasis in brewing as well, I think the stuff that I found the most fascinating has been yeast and the importance of that and the development of esters or phenolics dependent on temperature, which is something that we're mindful of at Westland, but I certainly didn't appreciate it the way that I do now.
Dude, have you ever been to Trillium?
The brewery, no, I've actually not. I've had some of the beers, but I've not physically been to the place.
I have an introduction to make for you the next time.
Oh man, here. I would gladly take you up on that.
I was doing a tasting at I was doing a whiskey tasting at Heritage of Sherborne, just like out in Sherborne, a Saturday tasting. Like people are just kind of trickling in. I'm selling them stuff, and this guy walks in and starts talking to me, and he kind of asked me some basic questions, and then he kind of asked me some more advanced questions. Then he started really asking me some really advanced questions, and finally I was like, Who the hell are you?
Yeah, what do you do?
What do you do? Like, where do you work? And he started cracking up and he goes, I can't remember it. You'll kill me because I can't remember his official title. But he was like the something or other director at Trillium.
Oh, yeah.
And he had just moved to Sherborne. And I was cracking up and I was talking to him and I was saying, I was like, oh, I'm dating just a Trillium fanatic. And you ever want, Trim doesn't do tours. And he was like, you ever want a private tour, just call me and I'll set you. I'll take you around myself. And he took me around and showed me all the different projects they were doing, and it was the coolest yeast experiments. And he actually was talking about how they have guys on their team whose sole job is to go hunt out rare wild yeast.
Oh yeah,
and I was just like, this is the cool. Like, when is this hitting the whiskey industry? And so, it's really interesting you talk about yeast and as really exciting. I remember when I talked to Bill Lumsden years ago, I asked him what's all right, cask, everything's cask. This was 5 years ago. And they were coming out with Sonalta and all these different things. I said, what's next? And he said, just give it 10 years. I have some yeast experiments that are going to blow your mind. And so I'm just like, and just to really humble brag some more, when I was at Miyagikyo Distillery, and I was asking them, because with Japanese whiskey, with Suntory and Nika basically having the same founding father, that the way that they were creating variations so that they could do all the Nika blends, they weren't able to trade with Suntory. So they were doing all these yeast experiments. They had 500 experimental yeast strands that they had been using. And so I'm just utterly fascinated to see over the next 10 years where whiskey goes from a yeast perspective. I know you're going to... Yeah, go ahead.
No, keep in mind, I mean, the irony with yeast, and I, to be honest with you, I find yeast probably the most fascinating just because it can do so many things. It's not just about using different strains of yeast. It's also about intentionally stressing the yeast through temperature triggers. So, putting yeast well above its temperature threshold, you've got to, you think about it, yeast, right, has two natural pathways, right? It's got an aerobic and anaerobic. So in the presence of oxygen, yeast will multiply, which is good, right? You need enough yeast. Now, obviously, you go to a professional brewery, they're building giant starters, which are designed, and not like starters like you're making terrible bread at home during COVID. I mean, like a real yeast starter. And, these starters are designed to make sure that like a very fast, clean fermentation can happen. So they're getting no off flavors. But there's the other side of it where it's like, what if you wanted to create a weird flavor? Like, what if we took, so we use T58, right? Belgian Saison brewer's yeast. We take this T58, we run it. I want to say its natural temperature range is like mid 60s to maybe mid 70s, very high 70, or like 75, 77, roughly. Don't quote me on that, but it's in that neck of the woods. What if you start it in the sort of classic range, right? Because you don't want it to stress it so much that it just shuts down. But what if you were to start it there like we do, let it free rise and let it run into like the low 80s? You're going to get really sort of big sort of estery flavors coming through, like pineapple and lemon zest and oranges and all those things. And when you look at the, again, upstream and downstream effect of that, the upstream effect is we've got roasted malt in our mash. We need something that's going to balance that bitter flavor. The downstream effect is, okay, you've now taken that bitter flavor, you've added a fruitiness for the fermentation, and you've got balanced whiskey, or balanced, we'll call it balanced wash down here. Now, through the distillation impact, and this is the kind of stuff I love to talk about, because I think for so long, people have thought of distillation incorrectly. And I don't mean people on the distilling side, but I think the average consumer tends to think of distillation as like, okay, the four of us are standing over a hill looking over a town. And I think people go like, okay, well, that's fermentation. Distillation in their mind is like you turn your body 90 degrees. That's not really the way it works. Distillation is like putting on a pair of binoculars and looking at something very precisely that's already down there. So if the flavor already exists, you can amplify it, you can magnify it more.
That is an outstanding analogy.
Yes. Yeah, Zach, I couldn't agree more. I wish people understood that a little more. It's one of the things that you hear in Scotch that drives me absolutely insane is 2/3 of the flavor comes from the wood.
My God, nothing annoys me more than that fucking statement.
Nothing annoys me more than that statement.
How do you measure percentage of flavor?
Not more than that, because it's not. I remember. I used to talk about this all the time. It's like what percent of my steak is the salt flavor? It's just like it's the dumbest. But aside from that, the thing that actually pissed me off about that is the wood can only enhance and only affect the flavors that are already there. And so like the idea, the concept of 2/3 of the flavor all comes from the wood, right? It's like, okay, we do this and then we add flavor with wood. And it's like, no. Like, absolutely not. There's so many other, not that there are so many other things. It's that is incredibly misleading, because the wood, as Sammy pointed out last week, the wood only imparts color and flavor and things that you're actually taking from it for a few months. What really is affecting the flavor is the oxidative process. And the oxidative process is about adding oxygen to the existing compounds. And so if you don't create those existing compounds, we're never going to get any flavor. So much for us not getting into the weeds of technical. Just so everybody knows, we obviously had a pre-meeting, and we were like, we're not going to talk about chemistry, not going to talk about science. We're going to stay really broad level. And here we are, just rambling on about like yeast fermentation.
To me, okay, so you want to talk about something genuine that's going to help the industry and it's going to help consumer choice and drive down whiskey prices long term. Honestly, it's becoming knowledgeable about the science of things, because it'll eliminate the opportunity for distilleries to make things opaque and then just go, well, that's why it's expensive. Like, that's not a good thing. Like, listen, there's nothing better or more terrifying than a smart consumer with disposable income. Like, you're going to determine how good whiskey gets over the next 10 to 15 years. If you're blown away by simple things, you're going to get simple things.
Phil, just clip that. Just clip that. We're putting that on the website right there. I love that. Okay.
Tim says it is time.
Time for the lightning round.
Gotta cut it off. It is time for the TNT White Lightning round. Come on. We pretend that we've been doing the show for years. To our millions of viewers out there, it's time, Dad.
All right.
So the first question in the TNT White Lightning round is, if you had to save 5 distilleries on the planet, which 5 would they be?
I would save Westland. I would save Ben Romick. I would save Bruichladdich. I would save Paul John. And I would save, I would save Starward.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
Chris, believe it or not, we've had 3 guests on the famous TNT show, and 2 of them have now said Starward.
So I would say Starward, one, because I love those guys, and I think their whiskey's incredible. But you'll also notice that I'm really kind of mindful of keeping whiskey, single malt whiskey, as being a global thing like that. I mean, American single malts, Australian single malt, Indian single malt. Like, listen, I think some of the Paul John stuff is really good. Not all of it is my cup of tea, but I think a lot of the stuff is super interesting. And I'm very curious to see more about their hot, humid climate kind of stuff and what that can do. And I listen, I'm all about people exploring the possibility of single malt and doing it in a way that creates knowledge, a larger knowledge base for all of us.
So for those of you who don't know what Paul John is, which maybe everyone does, but they are kind of number 2 in fame behind Amrut as an Indian whiskey distillery. And what's really cool is they are on the island of Goa, I believe, which is, or maybe it's not an island, in the area of Goa in India.
They're in Goa. I know that.
They're in Goa, which is a tropical climate. And so they're making this sort of younger tropical whiskey akin to Kavalan. And I freaking love Kavalan. Kavalan was one of my 5, even though they are probably a bigger version and maybe not espousing some of these younger like farm distilleries that I also really dig, but they make a great product. And I think that's a really, really, really cool pick. The other one that I would mention is when we were sitting at that table that Nick alluded to earlier with Sammy and you and Matt Hoffman, we asked this question to Matt Hoffman. It was actually the first time we've ever asked this question as a group. And when we sort of fell in love with it as a question. And his answers were crazy. Like, he didn't name a single distillery that you would expect to be in there. And one of the ones he named was one of the ones that I actually named last week, which is Chichibu.
Was it Tito's?
Incredibly. What was it? Tito's.
It had to have been Tito's.
Party, which just blew my mind.
Where do they make Captain Morgan? I'm sure he would have said that.
Yeah, exactly. But those are awesome answers. Okay. Question number 2.
Oh boy.
This is a new one for us, but we're thinking about making this
I
statement.
love that I get to guinea pig your new question.
Yeah, you're a guinea pig. Yeah. Okay, so question number 2 is, if you had to drink a spirit that is not whiskey, notice I said a spirit, not a beer, Chris.
Okay.
If you had to drink a spirit that is not whiskey, what would it be?
Oh, apple brandy.
Whoa!
I love
Ooh.
apple.
I love
think
that.
apple brandy.
I think
is
that's where it's
delicious.
at. Where all the interesting
Yeah.
stuff.
I really like apple brandy, and then a close second would probably be gin, to be honest.
What's
You're just
gin?
all over the place.
So I love Botanist. I think Botanist is fantastic, and I liked it before we sort of joined forces.
Not allowed. Out of
Okay,
Botanist.
so if I had to pick another gin, actually, you know what? I always forget to mention this, but there's a distillery up in Rochester. I want to say it's called like Black Button that makes really interesting gin. It's like really, really good quality.
We need Sammy on here.
Yeah, Jesus. We need Sammy. And I was expecting you to go with Karoon, but I understand that that's a competitive Scottish gin.
No.
So. You can't be propping up something that we rep over here. I get
No,
it. It's fine.
yeah, no,
It's
that's
fine.
fair. But
It's fine.
I mean, honestly, I really like apple brandy. I think it's so interesting. I'm actually super interested in the idea of fruit distillation. I think that's really sort of compelling. I'm in the process right now buying a couple of apple trees for my property. So it's, I feel like I'm halfway there to like getting into that side of things.
Call me. I know a guy.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean,
I need a tree guy. I need a fruit tree guy. Who do you know?
I know a fruit tree guy. I actually know a fruit tree guy, which is just absurd.
so Chris, I'm interested on that one just as a follow-up. Are you also a Calvados guy? Or are you mostly just, it's like when you say apple brandy, I think of it as the U.S. apple brandy. Like,
yeah, so I've had more domestic stuff than I have had Calvados. I've had some great Calvados. Obviously when we were over in France last year, I tasted a bunch of stuff, and it kills me because I didn't write it down, and I had a couple of beverages that night. But I was in a bar in Bordeaux. We were doing an event where we invited a bunch of cavistes, which is basically independent retailers in France, and we tasted through a bunch of our Westland Single Malts, and the guy was like, "Oh, do you like Calvados?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he brought over this thing, and it was just, I mean, it was absolutely mind-blowing, the depth of flavor that it had. And I was just thinking to myself, like, this is the kind of thing where if I got really inexpensive apple brandy, I wouldn't be upset to mix it in a drink. And if I got really fancy stuff, I would be more than happy to just drink it straight.
Do you make cocktails at home?
I don't make a ton of cocktails at home, to be honest with you. I brew a ton of beer down in the basement, and I have an enormous amount of whiskey here. I will say every once in a while I'll mix up gin and tonics for Suzer and I, but yeah, for the most part, I'm kind of a neat spirits guy for the most part.
I've always been that way until I got a personal cocktail lesson from Sammy, and now I've started making cocktails. I actually my pre-game drink was I made a Manhattan. I'm not allowed to call it a riff because all I did was replace the whiskey. So if Sammy says I'm not allowed to call it a riff, but I replaced my bourbon / rye with Westland peated.
Oh, interesting.
Awesome.
Actually. So we that's sort of our flagship cocktail. We've been doing a bunch of work on this called the Stateside Manhattan. So it's basically a Manhattan with Westland American oak, 2 ounces of Westland American oak, an ounce of good quality sweet vermouth. I like Carpano Antica, and then just 2 dashes of bitters with a Luxardo cocktail cherry, and that's pretty banging. We've actually got a.
I did that. I did literally exactly that, that, except I did it with the peated.
It's interesting with peated as well. I really like that cocktail, and it's again my challenge with cocktails, and this is where Sammy's so different. I feel like Sammy's very capable of making great drinks, and I think he also has, frankly, the patience to do it at home. I am usually like with a cut cigar in a hand, like trying to get outside to like go play with the dogs when I'm making a cocktail. And in my mind, like pouring whiskey into a glass is like a 2-second operation for me. Whereas, getting, sitting down and making like a really in-depth cocktail is a bit of a challenge. But yeah, I like peated old fashions, and I like American oak in my Manhattans.
It's really funny you mentioned that with Sammy. Have you watched his stir crazy cocktail videos?
I've not, but I'll tell you, I was in, this is a bit of a blast from the past, but many moons ago when Sammy and I were both at Martinetti, a wholesaler in Massachusetts, he was there doing a presentation on a tequila. I want to say it was Partita, and he was making cocktails during it. And I was like floored. I was like, I get up, I do a ton of distributor presentations, and I'm always just being like, all right, I got to make sure I get X, Y, and Z explained. And I explained to them, like, here's the easy selling story, right? That's what they want. And here's Sammy, like, whipping away, like, these cocktails, plus doing all this. And I'm like, it was like the governor's son doing a dance. It was incredible.
I'm going to tell you right now. I actually interviewed Sammy way before we hired him. And I was just like, how can somebody who's like, I'm so glad he's not on the thing right now, so he can't defend himself. But how can somebody who looks like he's 18 with a 50-year-old mustache be like the most knowledgeable fucking person I've ever met about cocktails? And I found out that when he was like 16, he started making cocktails at professionally. He's just absolutely ridiculous at that.
This industry is full of very average people that consider themselves exemplary. And I actually have a ton of respect for Sammy because I think he's actually a super bright guy and really knows his shit.
Yes.
Pretty much better than all of us.
Yeah, that's why we don't have him on here. He'd be outshining the shit out of us right now. Zach, do we have a third lightning round question? Because it's not gotten lightning, it's gotten sluggish.
Damn. We're getting into it. That's why the lightning round is tough.
I know.
It's a slow building storm.
Okay, so we have, you know what? We're going to give you the option. We have two. So the third one is a wild card, a TNT wild card. It's famous. And we have two different options for the wild card today, and you can answer either one. What's the title of your autobiography? Or what profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Ooh. All right, I'll do both because honestly, you asked two good questions, and I might as well do both. All right, so I feel like the title of my autobiography for sure would be "I'm not angry, I'm just passionate." 100%, like that is 1,000% the title of my autobiography. And then if I wasn't a commercial director at a distillery, I honestly, if I could go back and redo my career 100%, I would have really liked to been like a full-scale production person. I think now that I've gotten a real taste for the sciences and frankly doing a lot of home brewing at what I'd like to think is more than sort of a hobbyist level, I think I've really learned just how compelling I find the sciences. You know, I couldn't be bothered when I was a kid to focus on school. I'll be the first to admit I was always pretty fast talking and knew to do enough to get, B's and A minuses kind of thing. And now that I'm doing a program that is one incredibly challenging, but something that I'm genuinely interested in, I realize just how much more enjoyable school can be when you're doing something that you really want to learn about and you see the practical application of it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Everybody wants to go back to school after you're not in school anymore.
But like my height, like if you had asked like 10-year-old me what I really should have, like what I think I would have been great at, I would have loved to have been a National Park Service ranger. I would have loved that. I love being outside. I love hunting and fishing. I really like the outdoors. I like hiking. To me, like I one of the things honestly that really drew me to Westland when I came here was like there's a really strong sort of narrative to the outdoors and a love for the wild. And to me, that was a really big part. I came from, you guys will know, at G&M and Ben Romick, I love working with those guys, but it was a very different culture. You're not going to reinvent a 120-year-old company, nor is that the ambition of what they're trying to do. Whereas every day at Westland, it's about, adding another sort of pebble into that mountain of what we want to become. Yeah.
I wanted to just pause for a sec. I know we're already a little past 7. It's a little past your bedtime already, Chris, but that's okay. I know we have a bunch of questions from YouTube. Actually, we got some feedback that not everybody has Facebook, which is shocking. And so, Phil, fire away for us, will you?
Oh yeah. So let's see. We got a couple of questions here. From Teal, we've got a question.
You were just called a modern Ron Swanson, which is probably the biggest compliment one can get. So
I will certainly take that. Yeah.
I also wanted to follow up. Did we just form a partnership to start a new distillery? Because
Yes.
that's what I would. I don't know.
That seems right. Sorry, go ahead, Phil.
Sorry, Phil. Yeah.
So the question was, have you guys experimented with smoking the grain with other things beside peat?
We have not specifically, but there is a ton of experimentation happening with that, and especially in American single malt producers. You've got Colkegan down in New Mexico using mesquite. I know the guys at Balcones have done some of that as well. So yeah, I think that stuff exists. It's interesting. Actually, our maltster up in Skagit Valley Malting did some Garyana smoked 2-row pale. And I grabbed some from them. They were gracious enough to let me have some, and I brewed beer with it. And it was fantastic. I don't know. It's interesting when we think about Garyana, right? There's only so many ways to change that up. There's only so many different barrels or vatting styles that we're going to be able to do. Only so many ABVs. So maybe that's something down the line we look at. But as of right now, we've not experimented with that.
Okay. Let's go on.
The other question was, and there are actually a couple questions I was getting. There was one from Pablo, and this one was from the North Shore Whiskey Club.
Oh, nice.
But same question was basically, has Westland used Remy barrels, or has there been any plans for a Remy collaboration between Westland and Bruichladdich, for example?
So we haven't discussed the idea of a liquid collaboration. Obviously, the legalities of that and where it comes from and how it starts, that it is certainly more challenging than you might anticipate that it is. We have started to source barrels from other producers within the Remy family. One of the other interesting things is Remy Cointreau owns, or has an ownership, a stake in, I should say, of Sig & Moreau, which is a fantastic high quality cooperage, one that they have in France and then one in Napa as well, which has been great because we've actually been able to start sourcing Gary Oak barrels from the Sig & Moreau Napa cooperage as well.
Well,
that's cool. There was one other question, and that was, where was it? Would you rather have a Glengarry Bruichladdich or a Westland Black Arts?
No. It was, would you rather have a Westland Dark Arts or a Bruichladdich Garyana?
Yeah, that was it.
Oh God, they both feel dirty for some reason. So it's interesting. So you know, keep in mind, Black Art, if memory serves correct, and again, don't work at Bruichladdich, so this is from the passing understanding, but you know, the Black Art series is using, I think, quite a bit of wine casks in that, if memory serves correct. And obviously, you know, in the Northwest, we've got a fantastic winemaking culture. So we've actually sourced quite a bit of used Washington State winery barrels, and we'll have some releases for that stuff coming up. So yeah, I think obviously I'm a Westland guy. I'd love the commercial opportunity to have a Westland Dark Arts. I can tell you right now, we would never name it that though.
Slight issues with that.
Oh man.
All right. Should we wrap it up?
I want to call attention to one last thing, which was my favorite Westland Westland riff, which we missed out on this year because of the whole coronavirus and everything that was going on. But in the comments, I noticed Alex, my partner, she pointed out that I've educated her that the best whiskey is both bold and smooth.
Yeah, unfortunately we didn't release an April Fool's bottling this year. It's funny, we literally have it done. It's ready to go. But to be honest with you, in the context of what's going on this year with so many people struggling, genuinely, it didn't feel like the right thing to do. So one of the nice things is we are constantly running behind on trying to get these type of things done. So we have one in the hopper and ready to go for April 1st, 2021.
Oh, baby.
Yeah.
Chris, do us a solid, and just when you oh my God, you don't have Facebook, do you?
I do not.
OMG.
Okay.
Fine. Send it to me and I'll post it. I just gotta go. Oh God, I guess that just kills it because I'll just go find it myself.
Well, no,
actually,
the easiest way to get it, guys, is to have people go to our Vimeo page, Vimeo, and we have a whole page dedicated to Westland there, and you can watch some unbelievably funny videos we've done over the years for our our April Fool's bottlings.
The Bold Smooth. If I didn't know who Matt Hoffman was, I would be 100% sure he was a paid actor. He is so funny in the Bold Smooth video. I almost died. And you told me when that came out, like, so for anybody who doesn't know what Bold Smooth is, Westland does these April Fool's Day releases, and they're hilarious. And there was a video released when they did the Bold Smooth, which was 2018, 19?
It would have been 3 years ago. 3 years ago.
Wow, 2017? Oh, wow. Anyway, in 2017, they did the Bold Smooth release. It was chill filtered, color added, 40%, and it looked terrible. It looked like a Gatorade bottle.
You know what's super funny? Well, so we've done a bunch. Bold Smooth was this idea of like every terrible trope in the single malt industry, literally, forgive the pun, but like distilled down to one thing. So yeah, it was like 40%, heavily chill filtered, tons of caramel color. It's funny though, that whiskey literally changed the way that we thought about our April Fool's releases, because one of the unintended consequences of that was, and even though we made such a small amount, we realized that it was the first time that we had ever intentionally released a not good whiskey. And you actually have to be super careful from a distillery perspective about doing that. Like, you just don't know. Like, listen, someone goes to someone's house that has a bottle. They've never heard of Westland. They see the bottle because it was in like a fancy glass bottle and packaging, and someone goes, oh, I've never heard of Westland Bold Smooth, and then tries it. So what we've done here is it's actually changed where all of the releases now for April Fools, the concept is a joke, but the whiskey is not.
Oh, you turkeys.
Well, I'll tell you, man, last year we did, so obviously.
But that whiskey was actually legit because it went through a narwhal horn, if I remember, which actually is pretty legit.
For its aquatic prowess. So yeah, the April Fools releases, we had our Bold Smooth one. Then we obviously did. So prior to that, we did Inferno, and then the year before that, we did Tequila. So I'll give you a quick retrospective. So Tequila would have been back in 2015, and Tequila is a play on words. So Tequila is also the name of the first sort of town south of the King County border. So it was basically an agave spirit. So it was distilled agave nectar. Again, like literally the only time ever a non-single malt has been produced at Westland was Tequila. And it was basically designed to be like a joke on the word tequila. Then 2016, we did Inferno, which was Westland matured in an ex-Tabasco cask, which, dear God, is that stuff hot, because they literally forgot about it and left it like months too long. And it was just incredibly intensive. There's got to be bottles of that still sticking around. Like the only way I can drink it, and I've still got a few, is to drink it in a Bloody Mary, because you need like a ton of other flavors to balance it out.
Oh God.
Then obviously we did Bold Smooth. And then after Bold Smooth, we did a whiskey called, Sport Dram, whiskey for winners. So we did, we did a whiskey called Sport Dram, which was a heavily peated cask strength whiskey that was designed for the post-workout enthusiast. That was pretty fun. And then last year we did the Celebrius, which was actually one of my favorite whiskeys we've released from a liquid perspective, which was, I want to say Pale Malt, Washington Pale Malt, matured in an ex-tequila barrel, which was super interesting. And the idea was that it was a mirrored label because everyone deserves a celebrity whiskey, even you. So the idea was like you would look at yourself and see yourself and be like, that's my celebrity bottling. It was ridiculous.
Oh, man. Yeah,
Are there any plans for a gooey duck brined peated whiskey?
Nothing would make me happier than to literally do like a Pachuga style bottling where we hang a giant gooey duck in the still. I actually have a shirt that I got from Taylor Shellfish out on the peninsula that oh my God, in Samish Bay, just ridiculous. And it literally says gooey duck, the good time clam.
Oh God.
It's like one of my treasured possessions.
Chris, we can all get on the phone after this and keep talking all our wild ideas. But if we keep doing this, we're gonna lose our audience quick.
Fair enough.
Zach, you want to wrap us?
I do. Yeah, I mean, Chris, you're the man. Thank you so much for coming. This was awesome. We really enjoyed it. We realize we never promote anything at the end of these, so we're going to promote some stuff. So Westland Whiskey is freaking awesome. You guys should buy some of that. And Coldfoot is really interesting, and I haven't tried it yet, but that's a new collaboration that you guys have done and made some interesting noise about, and looks really interesting. It's a collaboration with the beer brewery, right, Chris?
Yep. It's a collaboration with Filson. So it's a Northwestern hard goods company that we've had a relationship with that's just down the road on up the road on First Avenue from us. It's literally the people that make all my shirts.
Oh, really?
Yeah, all my flannels are Filson. They're fantastic quality. You pay a little bit more, but honestly, it's always the best.
I love how you said all my shirts, and then afterwards you said, yeah, all my flannels come from. I actually wore this in honor of you. And Chris, just along the lines of promotion, I trust you're going to come guest teach one of the classes that we've started doing.
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right, perfect.
So can I leave
awesome.
everyone with a takeaway thought on Westland?
Yes.
All right. So I'll say this. Listen, we are a relatively small distillery. I'm sure all of you guys think about us, and we're relatively well known. We've done a great job picking up recognition, but we're still a relatively small distillery in the scheme of things. And I will tell you, if things like agriculture and things like provenance and transparency are important to you, your support means more than you could probably imagine. We are at that critical stage of building at our distillery right now where, frankly, we are very cognizant of what is being commercially successful within our range. And that's going to have a long-term impact on the kind of things that we do. So getting feedback from you guys through what you like and what you don't like is really important for us. And honestly, I couldn't be more proud of the team that we have at the distillery. And I'm incredibly thankful for the support that you guys at Taylor & Taylor have given us. But there are exciting things to come. And I encourage people, check us out on social media, join up on the website for the newsletter. You'll get something once a month and some interesting information on what we're doing. And then on Thursdays and Fridays, if you're available, we're doing Westland Live, where we're interviewing local people from the Pacific Northwest at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Pacific each night. And Thursday night is Nerd Night. We do really heady, geeky whiskey topics. And then Friday, we do sort of a celebration of a good cause in the Pacific Northwest.
Awesome.
Really cool.
Oh, very cool.
Cool.
What do we have to promote, Nick?
I don't know. We
do know it.
We know it. Yeah, we do classes.
We're even smaller than Westland, so
we're smaller than Westland. Yeah, Jesus. All right,
but
Phil. Cut the feed.
Thanks, everyone.
Love you.
Thank you again, Chris.
Bye, guys. You're the best.
We'll see everyone until next time.
Phil, I hope. Did you cut the feed yet?
Yeah.